Hello everybody, welcome to Red Tool House. From time to time I get a couple questions pertaining to the blades on the sawmill and how long they last or how many boards I can get out of the blades. So I thought, well, let's go ahead and do a video on that, and I'll discuss that, but then also show tips or tricks that I do to help maximize the lifetime of my blades. So let's go. So really the short answer to the question, how long do they last and how many boards can you mill with a blade, is, well, it depends. And I know everybody hates that answer on YouTube, but it really does. There's a lot of variables that come into play with the lifespan of a sawmill blade. But let's first talk about the obvious and most deadly thing to a blade. So clearly the most destructive thing you can do to a blade is to come in contact with metal when you're sawing. And so here's one of my blades off my dead pile, if you will. And what had happened is I actually hit metal that was embedded in one of my logs. So as I was analyzing the damage done to that, I actually wrote it out on my blade here. So I don't know if you can see that, but we had, this blade is 115 teeth total, and we have 25 of them missing, which is a total right around 20%. So just one contact with a piece of metal in a log took off 20% of my teeth. So if you see here close up, obviously that's what a good tooth looks like, one that's intact. But then we have some like you see here, where the tooth is actually missing or a big chunk of it's gone. So these carbide teeth blades, while they're really sharp and cut nicely, they don't bode well with metal. I've got to take my hat off. It is so humid down here in the forest, in the jungle, that my glasses won't quit fogging up with my hat on. So anyway, so you'd be surprised just how much metal you find and where you find it. Again, you normally find it in the logs, but metal that I've run into is cables. I've run into actual fence posts or chunks of fence posts that the tree's grown around, barbed wire, bullets. You can't see it because the tree's down, but there was a poplar tree I cut down right here that there used to be a trailer here. So the previous owners evidently liked to use that one poplar tree for target practice. Of course, I didn't know it, and as I cut into it, ended up hitting a lot of bullets, which that lead isn't as destructive as a hard ferrous metal, but it still does pretty good damage to it. But you know, nails, staples, screws, lag bolts, there's all kinds of things that show up in these logs that you don't necessarily see on the surface. And even a good metal detector isn't going to go 12 inches into a log and give you that indication that there's metal in there. So what I've discovered, the metal that's the most destructive to come in contact with your blade is the guides. So in this situation, just the other day, I don't know if you can see that little bite. No, that's not from termites. That is from the sawmill. And what that produced, in just a simple little short or a brief contact, was it produced a saw blade that kind of looks like your 95-year-old grandma. Got no teeth and twisted. So there is that, out of 115 teeth, there is not a single tooth left intact on that. That broke off every single one of those carbide tips. And this basically rendered this to be a fancy paperweight. So it's garbage. So if you can manage to avoid the metal, how long does a blade last? Well, just for reference, I got this mill, this Norwood mill, back in the fall, October of 2018. So we're creeping up on 3 years with the mill. And with the purchase of that mill, I got a box of 10 blades and I think 3 extra. I think 2 came with it, and I don't know, but for some reason I ended up with 13, not sure how. But so 13 blades, and right now I still have all the same blades except for the ones I've struck with metal. So I have 3 blades that are in the dead pile because they've had too many teeth removed from hitting metal, but the rest, the 10 rest, are still viable blades. So here are some things that I found that allow me to extend the life of my blades. And number one's kind of obvious, and you may have already said it right now. Well, Troy, yeah, you've got 13 blades in rotation, so naturally they're going to each last longer. And that's true. I say the more the merrier in that situation. Now, I actually have another box of blades in the workshop that's never been opened yet. And those blades are going to stay there until I really whittle down these 10 that I have left to nothing. But it's really kind of this concept of the more the merrier, especially if you're sharpening your own and you're rotating through. If you just had one blade and you milled and milled and milled and then had to stop and sharpen and set and then mill and mill and mill and stop and sharpen and set, it's not as efficient, but you're definitely going to shorten the lifespan of that blade, and I doubt if you're going to get 3 years out of it. So having more blades in rotation extends the life of the blades, but of course it requires a larger investment up front. But it gives you that fallback. In case you break one, you have those extras in reserve ready to go. So having multiple blades, I then put them in a rotation process. I have in my workshop these 2 racks. The top rack is my sharp set, my set of saw blades that are sharp, waiting to go onto the mill. And below are my dull set. And what I try to do is rotate those. So when I add a dull one, I put it to the back and move the next dullest one to the front, just kind of keep a rotation there. So by the time I'm going around sharpening, then of course everybody's gone through rotation. So everybody should experience the same number of sharpenings as we move along. Well, another thing that I found is helpful is don't try to get every last cut out of a blade before you remove it from the mill and take it in for sharpening. If I start to feel that blade get dull, so I got to push a little bit more, I'm seeing a little bit of ripple, then immediately get it off of there. Even though I feel, well, I can just push through this, I can finish this log, I can pass it. Don't do that, because it can actually make small fractures in the teeth. It can push the teeth out of set, out of the bend that they're in. So it can really start to make the blade deteriorate rapidly as it gets more dull. So I run them to the point where I start to notice a difference and then take them off and bring another. That's why having more in rotation is very helpful too. So another thing I've learned recently and try to implement on a regular basis is don't leave a blade on the mill if you're not going to run it for a while. So my mill's been idle since last weekend, and I don't want to leave that blade on there because in the heat and humidity and the fact that we're standing in the Amazon rainforest right now in central West Virginia, then I don't want to leave that on there where it's going to develop rust on one portion, and some sap, anything else can make it stick to the tires. There's all kinds of things that could become an issue if you leave that blade on. So if I know I'm going to walk away from the mill for a couple days, I go ahead and take that blade off and wipe it down and put it inside the workshop so it doesn't have the opportunity to build up corrosion, to build up sap, all of those type of things. It keeps it cleaner. So along that same lines, when they're in the workshop and it's time to give them a sharpen, then I actually will clean them first. I'll actually take my grinder with a wire brush and brush both sides of it, lay that blade out and kind of zip both sides of it to get any corrosion, to get any chunks off of that blade. Number one reason is it helps it go through my sharpener easier, because the sharpener has this thin channel that it passes through, so it gets that gunk out of there and allows that to pass through cleaner. But as you can see, when I stack them up here in my ready-to-go rack, they're much shinier. They may have a little stain on them, but they're much shinier, ready to go, and that just keeps them from that rust from growing and that gunk from hardening when it's in rotation. Another thing I've learned, and I've learned this with my chainsaw as well, is do a gentle sharpening. If on the front side you're not really dulling these teeth too much, then when it comes time to sharpen, you really don't have to put the grinding stone to them. You can actually be gentle with that. That, of course, obviously extends the life of that carbide tooth. It doesn't make it too thin. It doesn't wear it down. There's all kinds of benefits to that. And I still get a really good sharpen out of it. In fact, I've kind of honed my sharpening process. I have a video that I'll link to here of the sharpening system I use, but I've actually augmented that a little bit. And one of these days we'll do a video about that. And it's really allowed me to get a nice sharp edge without a lot of wear and tear on the stone or the blades themselves. So the last two key points have to do with the running of the mill itself. The first and the foremost is tensioning. So right now, since I don't have a blade on it, my tension handle is really loose. But with this Lumbermate, this LM29, their tensioning is actually pretty easy. You just bottom it out. You tension it all the way down, and that's at max tension. Different mills have different specs. They have guides, like my old Lumbermate 2000 had a guide, and you could see between these two marks is where you wanted to be. I've seen woodland mills, you actually use a torque wrench, so you tighten it to a certain torque. But running at the proper tension allows that blade, keeps it from flexing, keeps it from having any bends in it. If it's over tight, then of course you could blow the weld So that really comes in handy. So depending on the mill you have, you just want to make sure you are taking the time to attention to the proper specs. And lastly, I think the most important thing when it comes to operating is making sure your log, when it's in the round, that it's dogged down well. If you start making your first cut and you don't have that log properly secured, it can twist on you. In the past, with my old mill, I've had logs twist when I'm cutting, and it'll either jerk the blade off of the sawmill and kink it, or it'll actually just blow the weld completely out, and then you've got a damaged blade completely. So interestingly enough, when a blade actually fails, when it separates and ceases to be round, ceases to be a circle, it usually blows apart at the weld. And the weld, of course, these things don't come out round. They have to be, they're flat stock and they're welded and then machined to make that weld be as subtle as possible. But they're pretty easy to recognize. You can see the weld pretty easily on a blade, even with it stained and dirty. So it's one of those things you could possibly inspect your blade and just look around those welds and see if you can see any cracks. I've never been able to identify a crack and think, ooh, that's going to fail. Normally the cracks are so small that before you know it, bang, a blade flies apart and it's dead. So it's not like you can pre-screen that. At least in my experience, you haven't. Comment below if you guys have seen that before. So when you think about the cost of the blade, these blades that I run, the standard Norwood blades, run about $25 to $28, I think. So a box, by the time you get into shipping a box of 10, you're going to be $300 and a quarter maybe. But that's a decent investment. But when you look at running those for 3 years and producing, this is going on to be my third slab pile, and that's a pretty big pile. Produce a lot of lumber out of that for that type of investment. Now granted, the sharpener, of course, that helps me extend the life of my blade was about $800 as well. So that can really add to your expense, but you don't need a sharpener to be able to sharpen these blades. The sharpener just makes it efficient, allows me to sharpen quicker. But by hand, with a file, with a rotary tool, I'd recommend a rotary tool, you can sharpen that just as good as you can using these fancy sharpening systems. It's just going to take longer, and you're going to have to develop the skill to get a really true, consistent edge on it. Well, for several of you that were curious about that, I hope this video helps. And those of you that got mills, comment below, add to my list of things you do to help maintain and extend the life of your sawmill blades. All right, take care, everybody.